This video addresses some eerie interpretations of Scripture that can be detrimental to any believer's faith and where they can lead. I will be specifically referencing the YouTube channel Espresso with Sky. It is important to note that Sky is a pastor within a church that was founded in Korea, and he gets his information from the founder of the church. And years ago, I found some of the founder's interpretations convincing as well, but then I got deep enough into it to see where they led. He talks about everything from creation to the second coming, which is one reason why this is so important. For example, if one were to come to be convinced that the rapture has happened or that Jesus came back, or is right now even walking among us, they might be very misled, deemed a heretic, or at least someone who has not yet matured in the knowledge of Christ as mentioned in Ephesians chapter 4, and therefore should not be claiming to preach for Christ. A few other titles I considered were Eisegesis with Espresso with Sky, since, as we will later see, he brings in alien interpretations of Scripture, meaning he injects into Scripture concepts foreign to the immediate context of the chapter or verse. Response request for Espresso with Sky was also considered, since I would love to have a dialogue, but based on a few replies, it seems to me he doesn't find much interest in a discussion at this point. And finally, Coffee with Me, because imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and because I do have respect for Espresso with Sky. So what is the bulk of the interpretation? Some spiritual parabolic hidden meaning, as if to interpret it you need to be able to break the seal of the scroll in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9. But spiritualizing a verse that rather is a plain narrative or account diminishes the effect or impact on the reader of miracles that are actually truly supernatural, which decreases the majesty or glory we would otherwise properly ascribe to God, and sows distrust in Scripture, and ultimately could lure one to trust in other gods, books, humans, etc. For brevity and simplicity, we will focus on three plain miracles of Jesus in the Bible that are not to be interpreted as anything else other than actually supernatural occurrences. These are Jesus turning water into wine, feeding the 5,000, and walking on the water. I will give the interpretation that Sky and his teacher give, and then I'll provide the generally accepted Christian reading and explanation. For turning water into wine, the concept that Sky and his teacher inject into Scripture is that the word really means, or the word wine really means word. This would mean that water means word also. So the miracle, they say, is that there was word being preached at the wedding in Cana in Galilee, and that later in the night they ran out of good word, and Jesus turned the watery words into something more palatable and powerful as he preached. The miracle then to them is that Jesus preached something amazing. As for the generally accepted Christian interpretation over a couple thousand years, I would recommend reading the passage yourself. John chapter 2 verses 1 to 11. It reads like a simple story. This is the basic account of what Jesus did. When there is a parable in the New Testament, chances are it is spoken by Jesus and interpreted by Jesus. This account is neither spoken by nor interpreted by Jesus. If the point of this specific story was Jesus' preaching, then it would have said, Jesus preached, and possibly would have included what he preached, like repentance, good news, or the kingdom of heaven. And yet God concludes the passage writing, this was the beginning of his signs, as in signs and wonders. Now, feeding the 5,000, Sky and his teacher teach feeding really means preaching, which means that the food that was fed to the multitudes was word again, or words. And Jesus took loaves and fish words from the little boy and multiplied the loaves and fish words to satisfy the masses. But let's look at the context. The crowds had been following Jesus now for 3 days with nothing to eat. Sky would have to interpret this as saying Jesus had not preached to them for a whole 3 days, even though they'd been following him for some reason. What would be worse for Jesus to do? To not feed them some snacks for following him, or to starve them of the word of God for 3 days? In Mark's account, Jesus' disciples returned to him after a few days of serving and teaching, and they had no leisure even to eat. And Jesus says, come away and rest a while. And so they went, but the crowds found them, and Jesus had compassion on them and began to teach them many things. There is the teaching. But, in contrast, Scripture says when it was late, his disciples asked Jesus to send them away to the towns to buy something to eat. So, it is in this context that it only makes sense Jesus literally had compassion on them and literally let them rest and fed them with real physical food. This brings us to our final one for now, Jesus walking on the water. Sky and his teacher teach that either Jesus simply waded in the water, or that it was just some dream, vision, or illusion. They do not believe or teach what the Bible says, which is that Jesus physically came over to the disciples on the water while they were in the boat in the Sea of Galilee. But how do we know that he did? Again, reading Scripture ourselves, we know what lake they were on, and it was 8 miles wide and 13 miles long, 80 feet deep without any significant tide. In John chapter 6, we read that the boat was 3 to 4 miles from shore. From this knowledge alone, we could conclude that Jesus did not simply wade through the water. The text says that the disciples thought Jesus was a ghost or phantom, but that view is immediately discredited by Jesus and the disciples' interactions with him as well. In Matthew's account, Jesus even has Peter walking on the water too, until he lacks faith and sinks. But Jesus, who is still on top of the water, catches Peter, and they return to the boat. Furthermore, at the end of Mark's account, we read that the disciples were utterly astounded, for they had not understood about the loaves, which tells us the sign or wonder of Jesus causing the few loaves to feed the 5,000 was miraculous enough that his disciples should not have been so surprised by Jesus' power and control over creation, specifically expressed in the miracle of his walking on the water. So we see that spiritualizing these portions of Scripture, as well as others, diminishes the integrity of Scripture. This results in incorrect, incredible, and irresponsible interpretations, which pave paths for false prophets and false gospels. So here are a few verses to help keep you safe. Stay in the light, stay loyal to the Lord Jesus, and expect his appearance, which will be obvious to you who are in the light. First verse. Watch out for those who hinder the teaching which you learned, and turn away from them. They deceive the hearts of the unsuspecting. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come, but you are not in the darkness. You should not be overtaken as if by a thief in the night. Stand firm and hold to the traditions you were taught, whether by word of mouth or by letter from us. If anyone says he is in the wilderness or he is in the inner rooms, do not believe him, for just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. And so, if you would like to hear any more discussion on interpretations or inter-channel chat on these interpretations, please let us know.